Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
So I don't have Mr. McEneny's biography in front of me, but because I'm a librarian, I do know that he's written a couple books on the history of Albany. He's spoken in librarian groups before, and so here he's luckily he's read 1776. So so here he is to tell us about the book.
Thank you very much. I got a call yesterday afternoon. My daughter works for the district attorney, and she said, "How well do you like David Soares?" And I went, "This is not going to be a good call." And actually, I'm delighted. I do like David Soares, and I understand it's a lot better instead of having people come and find there's nobody there. But David is very disappointed. He and I do share books on occasion. I got him to read King Leopold's Ghost, which is an incredibly moving book that not enough people have read, on the Belgian Congo. And he, about a year ago, actually a few months ago, was off with his family and went in a bookstore, and he picked up two books. And one was the Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a pretty deep book, which he's loaned to me, which I haven't read, but I know about it. And the other was 1776, which he did read and has been talking about it for a matter of months. So he is very disappointed to be missing this. He is with the chief judge of the Court of Appeals, Judge Kay, on a task force out in Buffalo. And when the highest judge of the highest court asks you to stay there for something, you do it. So I spoke to him last night, and he expresses his regret and his disappointment because it's something where he had put his thoughts together and wanted to share them and see what people's reactions are. David McCullough is just one of the most outstanding writers that we have in the field of history. He's also very diversified. I remember when he came to Albany, Dardis McNamee, who was running Capital Region magazine at the time, got to spend a day with him and went all through the city of Albany, took him to the university and to different spots, and said, you know, what an absolutely delightful man, what an incredible day and a great opportunity. And in an interview a while ago, I read where he had said, I write in order to learn. And there's a certain type of historian who takes a specific field, instead of something that's broad and generic, and just exhausts that field. His other books, the Brooklyn Bridge that he's famous for, the Johnstown Flood, the book that he wrote on Truman, which he was shocked that it became the bestseller that it was, is an absolute expert. But that's his style. He will take a particular field and absolutely exhaust that field. And the American Revolution is such a broad field, and it's such a long war, that there are sources, but they have to leave an awful lot out, or they have to come up with a set of books on the shelf that you'll never get to read them all unless you're really in the field. And so he decided, he had written, as some of you know, the Adams book, which I actually listened to in the talking book, that Planting a Garden. I was listening to Adams and the wonderful letters between himself and his wife. There's over 1,000 letters back and forth. And that concentrated on politics and on the philosophy and his rivalry with Jefferson and what was going on in Philadelphia. And it was largely a political book and a philosophical book. 1776 is not that book. 1776 doesn't dwell on the politics and doesn't dwell on the philosophy. It takes 1 year. I spoke to David Soares at length last night and asked him, what did he get out of the book? What was unique about it? And his overwhelming observation was that the Declaration of Independence, which comes out in the middle of that year, is a wonderful document, and we tend to mythologize, if there is such a word, these documents, and we put them in hallowed shrines in our archives. But those archives, those documents have no worth unless there's an action connected with them. And the action was a painful action that unfortunately was necessary. And that was for average individuals in a country which at that time was well over 90% agricultural, a diversified country of 13 independent colonies, that individuals had to actually take up arms and not just pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, but actually go out there as rebels and take up arms and make the statement that had to be made, which in the long run was the most powerful statement that could be made, which is armed revolution against what was considered to be a lawful sovereign. And this is what McCullough writes about. He has three major sources in there that we are not familiar with. And there are three individuals who are, two of them are Connecticut farmers, and one of them is and I'll look at my spread out notes here now. And the other one is a tradesman from Massachusetts. And they wrote extensive diaries and letters back home. And the thing that is so overwhelming, because this is a book on the average soldier. This is a book that doesn't dwell on the politicians. And it deals with problems that you don't hear about. And it's a full, complete rendition of what went on in that fateful year of 1776. He starts out the book in Great Britain, and he describes 60,000 cheering Britons as George III goes to give a speech to Parliament. And I believe it took place probably in late 75, but the news hits in January of 76, the King's speech. And what George III does is he electrifies and he angers the colonists to an extraordinary degree, because he moves away from the rights of freeborn Englishmen and this internal problem within the empire, and basically declares them all traitors. And now you've moved into a whole different area. There's no more patience after Lexington and Concord, and too bad about the Boston Massacre and all those things that went on before 1776. They're traitors, and that's it. And this infuriates the colonists at the time. David Soares comes from a unique perspective. He is an immigrant. He was born in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of West Africa. Came here at the age of 6. He's also very much a New Englander. He was raised in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And while he has a Portuguese heritage, in fact spoke Portuguese as a young child, he is very much, by his own definition and the definition of society, an African American. He is a black man. And he said what he got out of this book, in reading the struggle that was going on and the hardship, and getting a complete look at people who really put their lives on the line and did without an awful lot, and threatened to ruin not only their good name, but lose their lives and destroy their families and everything that had been built up, in some case for a couple of generations here, is he got a respect that he really didn't have before. Before, he said, in all honesty, growing up, George Washington, he knew two things about him. He was the first president of the United States, and he was a slave owner, and wondered whether it would be worthwhile putting a picture that he had on the wall in the DA's office. After he read the book, he found a tremendous amount of empathy and a newborn respect for George Washington. Now, while there are many people who are mentioned in the book, particularly 4 of his generals, among them Nathaniel Greene, who is from Rhode Island, which is where David grew up. He found that what was so stunning was, one was the age. You know, Henry Knox, the fellow who went up, and the bookseller from Boston. And by the way, I read the book and they didn't put his weight in. I think he was 300 pounds too. They usually always mention that. I don't remember McCullough mentioning it because I kept looking for it and it wasn't there. At age 25, Henry Knox, I think he was a colonel at the time, eventually he winds up as Secretary of War in later years, goes in the dead of winter. And David says he runs back and forth to New England all the time, driving those 167 miles or whatever it is to Boston. And every time he gets on the Mass Pike, he thinks of traveling that in the dead of winter and going over to cross the Hudson River, to use the waterways, to use oxen, to use volunteer citizen soldiers, and to go up to Ticonderoga to take the captured guns and bring them all the way back. And in the first real offensive act of the war, to take on a very smug and sophisticated and well-trained British Army and to take over Dorchester Heights. And of course, Dorchester Heights, with those cannons, the reason why in 1776 the British evacuated Boston. And he says he can never drive the pike again without thinking of what a sacrifice that was. The other thing, which he says depresses him a bit, is the fact that he was 25 years old, and he's wondered now, being 10 years older, what has he done with his life? Nathaniel Greene, the general from Rhode Island, who was featured as perhaps one of the other heroes of the book, was about 33 years old, and he was a general. And the other thing was, I'm a ex-Fort William Henry guide. When I went to Siena, that was my summer job. And we always used to say, well, the French and Indian War was extraordinarily important to the colonies because that's where they learned how to fight. That's where they got to observe the regular British Army and to adapt tactics to North America and so on and so forth. Well, that war was over for fighting purposes in 1859 or 60. And Nathaniel Greene would have been way too young to have appreciated it or to have a responsible position. Washington was a noted exception, but it also means that Henry Knox was a 10-year-old. So they were neophytes. They were winging it. They were doing something that they had never done before, and they were book learned. They went to the books and they read about tactics and they listened to people, but these were not people who were skilled veterans who held responsible positions during the French and Indian War. This was the original amateur hour. And it's very, very impressive when you consider the age of these men and the lack of training and the extraordinary decisions they had to make. In 1776 is really our year, of those of us in the North. In later years, the action will move to the South, but that's far on into the Revolution. David observed that while we think of freeborn Englishmen and rights and so on and so forth, that there were no models. And so each individual soldier, whether he's one of the farmers with writing the letters back home, or whether he's holding a higher responsibility, knows he's fighting for freedom. There's no question about that. Knows that he wants to get out from under the crown. But nobody has a clear image of what's going to happen afterwards. The whole idea of what we consider the American democracy, etc., they're fighting for something vague. We look back on it with our mind's eye and we consider this a known quantity. Of course, this is what's going to happen. They don't know that. They only know that there's going to be some kind of freedom. They also don't have experience with the military. The area that I was most interested in was the area of the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, don't ever call it the Battle of Long Island. So there's some extraordinary things that go on there. There's a person that doesn't make the reviews and is not the hero that Knox or Greene is, but he's a person that I'm interested in, and so I'll mention him because he has an Albany connection. His name is William Alexander. I have 4 children. My oldest one, John, is a teacher and has been for 9 years on Lower Park Slope in Brooklyn, and he teaches in the William Alexander School, MS 51. And William Alexander is a hero of the Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn, which was fought on the very site of the school where he teaches. In fact, there's an old stone house that's been built, which was strategically important. He had a claim. He was well-to-do, a bit of a dandy. He liked his social life. His grandfather, I think, had been a royal governor of Nova Scotia, and he had been raised in privilege in New Jersey. He did have French and Indian War experience. And he also had something else. In the colonies, we referred to him as Lord Stirling. And I met the mayor of Stirling, which is in Scotland, who came over during the summer and quoted things that described him, contemporary accounts that described William Alexander as the bravest man in America. And I think that was a quote from Washington, because he was just an extraordinary soldier, extraordinary general. I think he was captured in McCullough's book and traded back. He had a claim to a lordship in Scotland. If he had been a Tory, and if he had put on a red uniform instead of a blue and buff uniform, undoubtedly that claim to also some hundreds of thousands of acres here in the New World would have been honored. So he was losing a great deal by picking the right side. In the end, at the end of the war was still technically on, the Treaty of Paris had not been put together. Lord Stirling, as he was socially known, was sent to Albany, New York, and he became the commander of the Northern Department of the Army, which is what we were during British terms and also in American terms. And he died in his 50s in Albany, New York, was buried from St. Peter's then Anglican Church, and was buried in Washington Park. We have no idea where, and when the bodies were removed after the Civil War from Washington Park, there was apparently no stone, because we have no record of him disappearing, going up to Albany Rural, where most of those removals went. But here was an individual who had a lot to gain from being a Tory. Adams describes in the earlier book by McCullough, he's quoted as saying he felt the city, or he felt the country was 1/3 Tory and 1/3 patriot and 1/3 waiting to see how it was all going to turn out. I went down to an archives meeting last Thursday in New York City, and we had a speaker whose name was Randall, and he has written books on Franklin and on Washington. And so a lot of this was fresh in my mind. It's William Stearns Randall, and he teaches at Champlain College. And he writes individual books. McCullough has taken a year and concentrated on that year, and concentrated not on what's going on in Philadelphia and in political circles, but what's going on in military circles. Randall has taken personalities and exhausted everything that he can find out about Washington and on Franklin. And these individuals, and that's what comes out in McCullough's books, these individuals are absolutely critical. I'm one of those people who believes in the great man theory of history, that one individual can make a difference. And in speaking to David last night, he said what impressed him, and the individual who really impressed him the most. One, he found enormous pride in his New England roots with Knox and with Greene, and mentioning places that he had grown up in and that he was very familiar with. But Washington, above all, impressed him. And he impressed him because it was very clear that Washington was aware that the war was not going well, that it's one strategic defeat after another, and yet somehow he managed to communicate to a very diverse army, most of whom were New Englanders with a different heritage than his Virginia aristocratic heritage, his plantation heritage. Somehow he was able to communicate confidence and communicate the message of fighting for freedom and the worth of the sacrifice. You know, this is not a pretty book in some places. We describe the open latrines. We describe people, their lust for plunder as they rob areas that they go through on the pretense of keeping the army alive. There's prostitution, there's rapes that go on, there's the constant problem with discipline. And then as the British Army comes in, there's the problem with reprisals. There's the constant worry while you're off doing your brave thing in a rebel's uniform, which is usually described as a ragtag army by McCullough. What happens if the British move in to your hometown and your village, and what's going to happen to your family and your property and your children, etc. So these people are under extraordinary deprivation and extraordinary risk because of what they're doing. And Washington is always the person who has the stability. There is an evolution of Washington in McCullough's book. And in the beginning, he has a great deal of disdain, and it's probably the right word, for the people who are fighting under him as the enlisted men. It's a different culture. He's a Virginia aristocrat. He has all these people who are a motley crew from New England. They come from the farming background, but it's not the kind of farming that he's used to. And throughout the course of 1776, looking at how these ordinary citizens survived and in fact distinguished themselves through battle and through deprivation and through disappointment after disappointment in moving on from one section to the other, eventually going down to New York City, which was a disaster because most of New York, at least lower New York and New Jersey, were Tory, they were loyalist. Washington grew, and he grew as an American to realize what extraordinary people he had underneath him, not just his general command, but the rank and file soldier, who is also brought out in the book because of their letters home. And what David was impressed with is how did he not convey his fears and his insecurities in a way that would have demoralized his own army. Because when things were darkest, there was always Washington. He was always the one with the confidence, with the upbeat look on what was going on, of the nobility of the cause. And the Declaration of Independence is a wonderful document, but without, unfortunately, the violence that had to take place of ordinary people taking up arms and going against the most powerful army in the world, this never would have been a reality, and we'd be speaking with somewhat different accents and serving tea instead of coffee in the back of the room today. General observations, as one who's sometimes a historian himself. Normal revolutions are the have-nots against the haves. And while there are certain elements of that, particularly here in New York State, where people who were well wired into the British Empire, the Schuylers and the Van Rensselaers, these were people of privilege, these were people with vast land holdings and claims and mercantile interests. Washington himself. These were individuals who were not uncomfortable in society in the leadership. And as far as the rank and file people that by our standards, without central heat and without the medical care and some of the nutrition that we take for granted today, never judge the past with contemporary eyes. They probably enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world at that time. So compared to the French Revolution model of people being extremely wealthy and other people starving, that isn't America at that time. It's based maybe less on the economic determinism that a Marxist historian would say, and more on the absolute ideal of freedom. It is truly idealistic in that way, in that freedom is the motivation. They don't know exactly what freedom means. They know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean being under a distant and uncaring monarchy. So there's some genuine idealism, even to the most cynical or the most economic determinist type of person. And when you take the individuals, and all we need to do is look around our area, but certainly Washington and many in New England, these were people of privilege. These were people who were bright for the day they were educated. They had a decent future. They had a stake in the society, which meant they had a great deal to lose. This is not the mob putting on a uniform. These are people who are making a statement and putting their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line for a somewhat vague ideal for the 18th century of freedom and of self-government. And as you read into it, you see that that's not just the myth done in the that's put into the standard high school patriotic, perhaps somewhat jingoistic textbook. This is actually something that's very real. And Washington is the one that makes it possible. He's not down there in arguing with the politicians and determining policies. He's on the cutting edge. And he's handed an inexperienced, untrained army, and somehow has to reach them, certainly not with pay or elegant uniforms or comfortable living conditions. He has to reach them with a vague ideal. And he also has to, through all of McCullough's book, because it's one defeat after another, as you know, he has to somehow convince them that the fight is still winnable, that it's worth it. So it's a wonderful book. it ties into something that I deal with all the time in my other hat in the state legislature. Most of the history books on the American Revolution are written by people from Massachusetts or Virginia. So if you were to pick up a standard American history book, you go from Boston to Virginia, and you go down to John Hancock and Patrick Henry, and if you diversify it all, you go into Philadelphia, and then they remind you that Benjamin Franklin is really born in Boston. There's a reason for that. The reason is ethnicity. If you know in our area, and now I'm moving away from the book review, if you ever looked at the names of our generals, we have our Schuylers and our Tenbrooks and Van Rensselaers and Keilers and so on, and there's a pattern. And the pattern is they all speak Dutch. And they hold lofty positions because if you're going to put your life on the line, you'd like to at least understand what the guy is saying when he sends you into battle. Our politicians are people like the Livingstons, a Scottish family here for 3 or 4 generations, who are completely bilingual, ethnically trusted by the others, and move very smoothly in between the Dutch families that they've married into, and also the people who are part of the standardized British Empire. Albany spoke Dutch, at least 50% of the people, up to the 1790s. And the other thing is, when you go west of here, you've got Palatine Germans, and that's why Baron Dieskau, or wrong war, excuse me, that's why Baron Steuben comes over, because he can speak German to the troops, because the troops are German. So our polyglot of New York is very different from New England or from the Cavaliers of Virginia. It's a different society, and we don't get to write the books. The turning point of the American Revolution is Saratoga. The largest battle of the Revolution is described in extraordinary detail in McCullough's book. It's the largest in the sense that it had the most people participating. It was the Battle of Brooklyn on Long Island in New York, never written up in a quick summary of the Revolution because we lost. We don't make a big deal out of it. If we want to talk big battles, we like to talk about Yorktown. That's a good one. The bloodiest battle of the American Revolution, that is the highest casualties and percentage of the people who actually participated, is Oriskany, far out the Mohawk Valley. So New York has an important position, not only because of its geography between New England and the Middle Atlantic and Southern colonies, but it also has a position of actually having some of the bloodiest battles. I think we have 1/3 of all the battles are fought in the state of New York. Now, when McCullough describes the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Brooklyn, that's really the turning point. And one of the reasons, and this goes back to my notes with my conversation with David, there were a couple of reasons why we came out successfully. We came out successfully, one, because of the personality of Washington and what he was able to get out of these rank and file soldiers. And the other reason is absolute total British arrogance, looking down on the ragtag army, assuming they had all the time in the world to make up for losses. If they had followed up in a timely fashion, they had 32,000 troops landed first on Staten Island and then eventually got over to Long Island. And they never bothered to follow up with the pursuit. And through a great deal of imagination, genius, and extraordinary courage, Washington was able to get his army across to Manhattan, upper Manhattan, and then go over to New Jersey. The book ends, appropriately in 1776, with a long-awaited victory, a victory which some people would put down because it didn't have a huge number of people involved, and that was the attack for the Christmas holiday, sneak attack, if you will, on Trenton in New Jersey, and defeating the Hessian troops that were there. So it starts out with the gauntlet thrown down. We're not talking about civil rights, with George III saying there's traitors and that's all there is to it and we have to stamp them out. And it ends with a victory, a long-awaited victory of somebody who was able to play It wasn't just cat and mouse. There were skirmishes and one major battle in there. But it ends with a much-needed psychological shot in the arm with the Battle of Trenton. It's a good approach that he takes. He takes an approach of taking this very complicated issue of the American Revolution with some extraordinary individuals and stripping it down away from the politics, which are very necessary, away from the European diplomacy, because ultimately it will be Spanish money and French troops that will bring this to a close. So that's another whole section in there, and he covers that with when he does Adams, for example. But going down to the reality that someone had to take up arms, somebody had to go through that extraordinarily difficult year, which will have the Declaration of Independence right smack in the middle of it, and go from struggle to struggle, defeat to defeat, and eventually wind up with a minor victory, but the very fact that the army was still intact and still in the field, that's what made this country what it is today. So he picked a good approach to break it down as he has done. As McCullough says, I write so I can learn. And he exhausted this one period, this time taking one section, the military section of a year, and really making a major contribution. I think at the end of the book, David, who talks about it constantly, up went the picture of Washington with a new understanding and a new respect. And his final comments last night, which was around 11:30, were I wonder how many people in leadership positions in America today, political positions, one would ever accomplish half as much at the same age as some of these very young men. But also, do they actually understand what a legacy they've inherited, or do they just take it for granted? And is George Washington just an historic figure that you name streets and cities after and counties after and put his picture on a $1 bill? Or is he actually the genius who came to the right place at the right time in history and really qualifies for the great man in history status? So I've talked a bit on it, one more bit of Albany trivia on it. The next year would be the Battle of Saratoga, which would be the turning point, because it would tell the Dutch and the Spanish and the French that something was really going on here, that it was really winnable, and then they would contribute in a number of ways to create the kind of alliance that you need to defeat the most powerful military empire in the world. And as you know, there were Hessian troops, German troops, who were brought in, deeply, deeply resented by the Americans because they were foreign. They spoke a foreign language, except when they were in the Mohawk Valley, because they were speaking German anyway, in parts of Pennsylvania. But one of the battles that took place in New York State, which we like to think of as the Battle of Walloomsock, and we have a state park on the battlefield, but since the nearest town was across the line in Bennington, it's now the Battle of Bennington, which, by the way, was a part of Albany County at the time. Some of the German troops, the Hessian troops, were sent out foraging and skirmishing, and they had been assured that the locals would greet them with wild enthusiasm, and they would be liberating them from this ragtag army of rebels. And one of those Hessians found out the hard way that that was not the case, and he deserted. And his great whatever grandchild is Father Young. No. That's where Father Young's name came from. I made a mistake of sneaking into a 4 o'clock mass down at Our Lady Help of Christians, which is reopened as Mother Teresa's, and I looked awful and had jeans and had been cleaning an attic, as a matter of fact, and figured nobody will know me there and I'll go in the back pew. And then Father Young saw me, introduced me. I went 10 minutes late, thinking it was safe, not realizing it was Father Young, who hadn't begun yet. And he brought me up front and had me do a reading and so on, and then asked if I'd give a verbal tour of the church, which is a German church. And his comment after was that he was well familiar with Germans. Young was originally J-U-N-G, and related the fact that that's where the Youngs came from, as one of the Hessians that saw the light and snuck off and and became good Americans. So sometimes we don't know, that is it, 6 degrees of separation. You never have to go to 6. There's always a connection. But I think McCullough has done something that we need to do in this country. We need to think of the Founding Fathers as individuals and get away from some of the stereotypes of wooden false teeth and cherry trees and things like that, and understand that we can't judge them with our eyes. They were born into a world of slavery. They never questioned it. It was there. It was the way of the world. And some of them, Jefferson's original Declaration of Independence, has the longest statement and the most forceful and moving is a condemnation of slavery, which was not acceptable to the group, and so it's not in there today. It was read at the review that I was at on Thursday. But with that, I'm going to cut it off and say that David apologizes. He's been talking about this book for some time and is very sorry that he didn't make it, and I see it's taped now, so we'll have to save him a copy of the tape or the CD. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. And thank you for having me. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Throughout the book, it appears that Washington's contemporaries refer to him as Your Excellency.
Yes.
And could you touch upon how that appellation kind of reached its demise and the term president was eventually...
By his choice. He is also in the book described as living very elegantly when he goes into Boston and takes the best mansion available and was made sure that he had decent wines and things like that. He also did something else. I think it was Churchill told, it wasn't Roosevelt. I think, yeah, it was Roosevelt. You've got to do something else or this will drive you crazy. And you've got to have an outside interest. And so in all the blood and carnage and the weight of office, Churchill was a painter. And that's how he took the pressure off. Washington had an outlet also, and it was still Mount Vernon. So in the middle of things, he's ordering a type of wainscoting that he can put down in Mount Vernon. And in his mind, he's always the gentleman architect and always improving. He's the gentleman farmer. Washington did want to be Cincinnatus at the bridge. And in Roman history, you'll recall that Cincinnatus gets at the bridge and he makes a decision, but at the end of it, he wants to go back and be a farmer. And people didn't understand the democracy. When they built the White House, they wanted to call it the palace. Now, Washington was personally involved, saying, no, we don't have palaces. And his title, at one point, Congress wanted it to be His High Mightiness. And Washington said no. Washington could have easily been a monarch. I mean, that's what happened with a number of revolutions in South America, where they started out as republics and wound up, in the case of Mexico, as an empire. He could have done it, and he chose not to do it. He lived very well. You know, there's a book out on Washington's account book. He worked for $1 a year, but we would have been better off to pay him $100,000 because he had a very expensive, not a White House for him because it wasn't built yet, but he had a very expensive and elegant taste in living. He was a Virginia planter and a gentleman. But those outward trappings that could have easily slipped into a monarchy, maybe a constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy just the same. Washington personally has to be given credit for stopping that, because it would have been nothing. The country was so grateful to him, and they did realize what he did, that they would have heaped any honor they possibly could on him. And it was Washington himself who put the brakes on it. And also it was Washington who couldn't wait to get out of uniform after the Revolution. And it was Washington, and I think he also kept a title as an elected member of the House of Burgesses through the war, but obviously didn't show up, and held many titles. They talk about career politicians. These guys were never without a title somewhere. They never tell you that part. They might have gone from one to the other, but they were always involved in all kinds of municipal and state governmental things. So they were true Renaissance men in that they dabbled in everything. But he desperately wanted to go back to the farm, and at the end of 8 years, he did two things. One, the speech on no entangling alliances, which we could have easily gotten sucked into world politics before we were ready to do it. And the other one he did is after 8 years, I mean, he was president for life. He chose not to be. So the titles, the palace, the high mightiness, it was Washington himself, even though in many ways we would surely call him an aristocrat. And like so many of those people, he would be, the family tree would get him back to, who was it, Edward II or somebody, or Edward III that everybody seems to be descendant of, including Nixon and probably the Fords, etc. Interesting observation, not in McCullough's book. And one of the things they never did, the British government, is they never gave out the titles in the New World. Now they had 10 million English, and they had almost 3 million Americans. And you wonder, one, they could have called our bluff and given us some seats in Parliament and then taxed the hell out of us. And that would be the end of taxation without representation. If you think that's tough, it can be tough with representation too. So that issue surely would have gone away. But they could have also given out titles. To my knowledge, there were only 2 titles ever given out in North America. One is Lord Fairfax down in Virginia. And I'm not sure what Lord Fairfax had, whether it was a baron or I don't think it was as high as an earl. The other was the Baronet of the British Empire in New York. That title still exists. It's up in Canada. And that was given to Sir William Johnson, who then passed it on to his nephews and his collateral descendants. But other than that, it would have been very easy for the Crown to take some of these up-and-coming young men and recognize them with hereditary titles. That may have been a big mistake. One of the things that was very hurtful to George Washington in his early career is Washington came from yeoman stock, but well-to-do and prosperous, and they brought themselves up through hard work and labor in Virginia, and he was well-connected. And Governor Dinwiddie gave him a commission as a colonel. He was either 19 or 21 years old. He was on Braddock's defeat, behaved admirably there, and his brother worked for Admiral Vernon, and I think he had the actual commission in the British Army. And he died of smallpox. And Washington was very close to his brother, and that's why the house is called Mount Vernon. And it was in the Battle of Cartagena against the Spanish in the Caribbean and so on. And this older brother was a role model. So were some of these British military people, and he wanted desperately to get a commission. He had a commission, but it was strictly Virginia militia, and he was turned down by the British Army. And here were God knows how many people of ability and certainly initially loyalty that could have been brought into that empire, and yet whatever insensitivity it was, the British never reached out to them. They were never quite good enough, and there were the seeds of discontent. 1/3 of Washington's regular army, this is not the militia, the summer soldiers, etc., were Irish, primarily Ulster Presbyterians, and when everybody went home, they were always there. And these people had all kinds of issues of being stranded in Ulster without support from the Crown, and were very influential in making sure that we became a republic. There were Germans who spoke German in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, up here in the Mohawk Valley. There were a number of people. The ones who stayed actually loyal to the Crown were Scottish Highlanders. And a lot of them wound up in Nova Scotia, and a lot of them went north with the Johnsons. But you know, it was more ethnically diverse than they thought. They were people who were used to defending themselves with the militia because of the threat of French America, and the British just totally blundered. In the movie The Madness of King George, that's King George, is a very sympathetic rendition of him. That's his greatest regret. That he was so enthralled with America, but he made that decision and he made that speech, and he created himself as the poster child of tyranny. And believe me, history would have been very different. What's the movie Sliding Doors, where Whether you get on the subway or not, your whole life changes. There are so many of those cases that all of history could have been changed very easily if somebody had made a different decision. Anyone else? Yes. Yes.
I didn't read this book. I'm going to. Your review has been overwhelmingly wonderful.
Thank you.
I did read the John Adams book.
Yes.
And I do want to ask you this question. When I read it, I just felt that I was there. I just didn't want to leave that 18th century. I wanted to know so much about a small little world that we were in and the characters that made us what we are today, at least the foundation. And then I wondered, getting to know John Adams, the kind of thinking he had, the morality of the man, and his Abigail, and the words that they spoke to each other. And then the Thomas Jefferson with all the things we're learning now that we don't like, but we do know the things we do like. We'll never forget those words that he penned. And it's so comfortable to be there. It's small. We know we've saved something we love, and we're part of it. We feel so close to it. So many books are coming out. I don't think any other generation has gone so much into the past and loved it and didn't want to leave it. And I'm just wondering if it's a reflection of our times, that we feel that this is so big, our country, so many problems, so diverse, so many sections that we all don't really relate to. We're still feeling the pangs of civil war and the differences. I'm just wondering in my mind who we would like today to know so much of their lives, to be so much a part of it. And I said, well, I tossed away the president and the vice president and his staff, and I sought for an answer. And I was thinking of who do I want to know so well? Who do I want to feel that I'm comfortable with, and he's part of me in this country and speaks my language, and I don't have to explain myself. And there was nobody. So I said to myself, McCullough's right. He's way back in the 18th century. He's so happy there. He doesn't want to leave it. And he's gotten to know everybody so intimately. There's a sense of comfort there.
He likes Truman, too.
Is there something to what I'm saying?
Yes.
Let me give you my observations, because I deal in public life all the time. I'm 63. When I was 17 years old, I listened to JFK's speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, etc. I went in the Peace Corps, was in the war on poverty. It was a very idealistic age. We Americans felt we could solve the problems of the world. Perhaps it was a naive age. And then, of course, the smartest thing to do in public life is to die young. And a lot of people, they get it enshrined there. And today, in recent years, JFK's image is not what it used to be. And maybe we were naive. One of the hardest things to accept in life as you grow older is that good people can do bad things. Bad people can do good things. And that everything is very complex. One of the problems with young people today, as opposed to when I grew up, I got out of high school in 1961 in Siena at 1965, is they have grown up in an age without heroes. I can still tell you the baseball players that were the Yankees and the Dodgers in the 50s and the early 60s. I don't think I could tell you them now. It is an age without heroes. You don't get it in the clergy. You don't get it in business. You don't get it in politics. You don't get it in sports. You don't get it in public entertainers. Where are the heroes? Sometimes I think we enjoy a book like this because it reassures us that there is some goodness and some courage and some outstanding qualities that man is capable of. It's an age without heroes. Diversity. I just mentioned different languages. People are still speaking Dutch. The time of the American Revolution was extremely diverse, more so than you would read in particularly 20-year-old textbooks. I don't think that's it. I think we have tended to concentrate on the failures of individuals. And we've overlooked and we've lost the tolerance for the greatness that's in them too. Sometimes people have their weak points and they compensate in life by developing very strong points. And a lot of the ones in the middle that are mediocre, they don't seem to accomplish a great deal. But for those who are concerned about an age without heroes, in almost every facet of American life, public, private, religious, etc., it is somewhat comforting to go back to a different age and to get to know these people who for so long were turned into cardboard and find out that they too had flesh and blood and passions and interest and dedication, and that they overcame adversity, and they may have started out with biases, they may have started out as slave owners and found redemption in the course of their life by either what they did or what they tried to do. I'm sure Washington didn't have a high opinion, at least in McCullough's book, of who these people would be from New England. And at the end of a year, they were his heroes. So I think there's a great deal of inspiration in going back to a period like this. McCullough writes about Truman, and you feel enlightened at the end of that book. I also, I listened to that when I had got one of the talking books on a long trip. There's a great deal of goodness in human nature. And McCullough, without glossing anything over, manages to go out, and in the end, we are inspired. David Soares, who knew about a historic person that was here long before his people got here, who was in fact a slave owner for his entire life. David has a new understanding, and up went the picture of Washington. We need more people to do that kind of critical study. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.